is such a pleasure to be here. I appreciate very much being invited to give this talk. I'm going to give two talks today, and they are actually quite similar. There's a lot of overlap between the two talks, and that's important because I'm going to be talking about the brain. And so this will be a memory test. We will see one talk now, and then I'll talk 2 hours from now, and we'll see what you remembered from the first talk. I'm going to talk, the first talk is about iron and neurodevelopment. There are many people who are interested in the role of iron. Iron is a very interesting compound or nutrient because it is very necessary for brain development, but it's also potentially very dangerous nutrient. It's regulated in a very narrow range. And that's kind of fun. It has kind of a bad boy quality to it. I'll be going into great depth in this talk about iron deficiency and who is at risk for iron deficiency as a newborn, what affects iron balance in the newborn, including the premature, a little bit about, or actually quite a bit about, what do you need iron for in the brain? What does it do in the brain? And finally, just a little bit at the end about iron dosing. And the reason there will be very little about iron dosing is because the recommendations for iron for the preterm infant really have not changed since 1992. We found very little reason to change, although I will give you one recommendation about iron in the follow-up period after discharge. So the talk is divided really into several parts, and the first part we'll do both in this talk and in the second talk, and that is to discuss basic principles of brain and nutrient interactions. Now, you've already heard several talks about why we need to give good nutrition because it affects neurodevelopment. And I'm going to try and give you a better idea of what's happening inside the brain and what particular brain areas are vulnerable in the premature and the term baby. Then we'll talk specifically about iron in the developing brain. Then we'll use iron deficiency, that is the lack of iron, as a way of talking about its effect on preterm infants and on brain development. I'll tell you some studies that we've done in humans, not so much in preterm, but in term babies. And then also show you some models, some rat models of what happens to the brain, pictures of what happens to the brain, and specifically to the hippocampus. You heard about the hippocampus yesterday. It's an area that's very important for recognition memory. And at the end we'll talk about the dosing. Okay, so a general principle, something that was actually codified back in 1996, is that any positive or negative nutrient effect, and actually this could be, you don't even have to think about nutrients, you could think of any environmental effect on the brain. It could be stress, it could be hypoxia, it could be hypoglycemia. But the positive or negative effect of any nutrient on the brain is going to be based on the timing when that occurred, the dose, meaning how much or how little, and the duration of that exposure. So think of that as an area under the curve. Okay? Imagine a curve. How much area is there under that curve? And that combines the idea of dose and the duration of the exposure. And it's those factors that kind of determine what the risk is to the brain. I think the important thing to know is that the brain is not a homogeneous organ. There are many different parts to the brain, and they develop at very different paces. So various brain regions like the hippocampus and the cortex and the striatum and hypothalamus develop at different times during gestation, during postnatal life, and on throughout the lifespan, thank goodness. Same with processes, and here I'm talking about global processes like myelination. Myelination has an onset, a peak, and then, unfortunately, some decrement over time. The vulnerability of any of these brain regions or processes to a nutrient deficit is going to be based on two things. One, is that nutrient deficit likely to occur when the brain needs that nutrient. And secondly, what's the brain's requirement for that nutrient? How much does the brain need? Or how much does that brain area need? And finally, when we talk about somebody had a nutrient deficit or got a nutrient supplement and it gave us a better IQ or it gave us a better memory, we have to make sure that the behavioral changes that we're looking at long term map onto those brain structures that were altered by the nutrient. So all of these things have to come together for us to say, yes, there's a biologically plausible mechanism by which this nutrient, either its excess or its supplement or its decrement, its deficiency, affected a specific brain area. I'm going to argue that neonatal iron deficiency is a good example to look at to see these principles. Okay, this is one of my favorite slides. My graduate students actually hate this slide, but I love this slide. This is human brain development throughout the lifespan. And I want you to notice a few things. So here is birth, and notice how much of the brain is developing even before birth. We have myelination, as you heard yesterday, beginning 2 months before term birth. The hippocampus is completely wired by the time of birth, and in fact we now have evidence that back as early as 28 weeks, baby's hippocampus is working, or fetal hippocampus is working. The visual cortex and the auditory cortex are both developing prenatally. Okay? So we don't think very much about babies seeing in utero, but in fact the visual cortex is starting to develop prior to term birth. Even areas like the frontal lobe, which we think of as being mediating behaviors much later in life, executive function, the ability to multitask, is actually starting to develop around the time of birth. You then see a tremendous peak, and this is not really quantitative, but it gives you an idea of what's going on. Much more activity in the first 12 months, and certainly in the first 3 years. And of course, that is why we target children for developmental enhancement, infant stimulation, early intervention in 0 to 3 programs, 0 to 3 year programs, and because of all of this activity that's going on. But notice that myelination continues out to 5 to 10 years, synaptogenesis out to 15 to 18 years, and certainly in the hippocampus, experience-dependent synapse formation occurs throughout the lifespan. We learn throughout the lifespan. In fact, you are making new cells in the hippocampus at least into your 50s, and if we're lucky, maybe beyond. So I find this very hopeful. I also find this very grounded in reality, because you notice in the teenage years, and I don't know how many of you have teenage children, but you notice in the teenage years how everything stops. And this has been my experience with my children, is everything just kind of stops them. Fortunately, we have some recovery here. Okay, we're going to use this slide in this talk and also in the other talk as we go through all of the nutrients. Now what I've outlined here is where in the lifespan of the child you are likely to find iron deficiency. So iron deficiency is not a huge problem during certain time points, but it is a problem during late gestation and during prematurity. It is a problem classically, and this is what, of course, Betsy Lozoff and Thomas Walter and so on have so nicely described, between 6 months of age and 1.5 to 2 years of age. So that's the classic toddler iron deficiency. And then there is another peak out at 13 to 15 years. This is usually in girls who are starting to have menses and who, at least in the United States, start to eat all sorts of bizarre diets. So, and what is interesting about these three, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but what's interesting about these three is that all 3 time points are characterized by memory deficits if you are iron deficient. So if you have populations that are iron deficient in these time points, you will affect memory performance. 2 of these, the first 2, the performance deficit is permanent. or at least as permanent as we have been able to study. That is, if you're iron deficient here and you measure memory out as long as 20 years out after iron deficiency, there are still long-term effects. Interestingly, if you are iron deficient at 13 to 15, or for that matter, any time out here, correction of the iron deficiency erases the memory deficits. That is, the memory recovers. And what that tells me in terms of brain processes is that this is probably an effect on neurotransmitters, that is, on the function of the brain, whereas iron deficiency back here is affecting the structure, the fundamental structure of the brain, with critical periods that are not being recovered from. So, and I'm going to show you some data from the rodents, from the rats, that supports that idea. Okay, so we're going to talk about this first time period. Now, what do you need iron for? Iron is a critical nutrient for the developing brain. It affects processes of myelination, that is, an enzyme that is involved in the production of fatty acids in the oligodendrocytes for myelin is iron containing, as well as the energy producing cytochromes that are in the oligodendrocytes. So if you have a rodent model of iron deficiency or iron deficiency anemia, that rodent will be hypomyelinated, low myelin. Cytochromes, which you all know are important in generating ATP, mediating oxidative phosphorylation. They determine not just neuronal energy status, but glial energy status. And the consequence of that, again, if you use a model of rodent iron deficiency, is impaired growth, impaired differentiation. That means that the dendrites of the neurons are not normal looking, and impairs how the neurons function, impairs the electrophysiology. And finally, tyrosine hydroxylase, which is an enzyme that is involved in synthesizing dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, is iron dependent. And so deficiencies in iron cause altered transmission of dopamine and serotonin. So those will probably, we'll talk about this, but those affect affect, mood, social interaction. So you can see that the effects are potentially very wide-ranging. Every cell needs iron, and in particular in the nervous system, these are some of the important things regarding brain function. But you all probably are also aware that iron is a significant risk to the developing brain. It is a potent oxidant stressor. It interacts with oxygen to create reactive oxygen species. And iron overload in adults has been associated with all sorts of neurodegenerative disorders. Now, why do we worry about that in the preterm infant? Well, we all know that the preterm infant has very poor oxidative defenses, antioxidants, generally low, and also are very poor at protein synthesis. That is, in general, premature babies have lower serum protein levels, including the iron-binding protein transferrin. So we have a low capacity to bind iron coupled with an underdeveloped antioxidant system. And so what that tells me is that whereas we may need iron to build a good brain, we need to also be careful about the top end, how much iron is too much for the premature infant. And so to codify that, we in nutrition generally talk about U-shaped nutrition risk curves. That is, that if you plot the risk of side effects or the risk to the individual as a function of the dose, that someplace in the adequacy range we have our lowest risk from a nutrient, that when we become deficient, it increases our risk of a bad outcome. But we also forget sometimes that risk increases with overload as well. And so when we talk about increasing this nutrient or that nutrient, whether it's DHA or protein or iron